Welcome to Homestead Reptile. Today's episode of Morph History is on empty backs, one of the more confusing morphs out there. So my guy right here is a empty back. He would be considered a super empty back and not a het empty back. And empty backs are incomplete dominant, but you can have hets, and I'll talk a little bit more about that a little later. It's a little confusing. Now, empty backs, a little bit of the history, were first produced by Alan Rapace. So the timeline's a tad bit confusing. So he either produced these in 2007 or 2008 or 2002. Again, timeline's a little confusing. But AC Reptile also had empty backs, and they got them in the early 2000s. That's why I said timeline's confusing. He got them from Alan Rapace. Now, AC Reptile has more what I would call advanced empty backs, where they're really emptied, the head's emptied out. With my guy, you can kind of see a hint of that emptying out of the head. You can see that where the tangerine color is on the head. You can see the little bit of the emptying where it's a little bit darker, and that would be showing the base color. But he comes from AC Reptile, but you can kind of see the hint of the head emptying. But they can become so advanced where the head's emptied out and the whole dorsal head, neck is completely empty. It's just the base color. So empty backs it's a morph that reduces the color and saturation of the dorsal, the back, and the head. So it removes color. Simple as that, removes color, and you can have hets. So a het empty back is the animal that has that reduction in color and pattern on the dorsal, but not as extreme as a super empty back, and that's why they call them het empty backs. So they did a breeding ratio where the breeding results of hets, so 1:2:1 ratio. Siblings who are het present with a reduced pattern. Siblings that are not het empty backs or normal colored pattern with pinstripe. So those animals that were hets produced other empty backs, and the ones that did not have that dorsal pattern reduction didn't produce any empty backs. And super stripe and empty back are also connected to each other. It's interesting because it seems that animals that are super stripes produce animals that are empty backs. So it's almost like they're very hooked together. Like I said, it's a confusing morph that super stripes seem to be hooked into empty backs, and empty backs have also produced some super stripes. So it's interesting that these two morphs are likely to be hooked together, and super stripe is a recessive gene. So again, it's interesting. There's a lot of things that come in with empty backs. Again, it's like the breeding results are very interesting when they had hets. And again, this is an incomplete dominant trait, and they call it hets because the het empty backs are just a less extreme example of an empty back, and I will show you some examples of that. Now, the empty back colors, base colors, are interesting. So they come in a few base colors. So the most common ones are black, you have yellow, you have red, and you have tangerine. And the pinstripes can be different colors depending on what the color of the animal is. So my guy is a black base tangerine. So his pinning is a creamier tangerine color. So that's really common for the pinstriping to be the color, for it to be that color, that tangerine-ish color. You can also have a red, cream, or white dorsal striping, the pinstriping. It really depends on the makeup of the gecko. And again, like I said, it reduces the pattern on the back of the gecko. It's in the name, empty back. They're a fun morph. They're interesting. They have no health issues. So, like I said, they come from, they originally came from Alan Rapace when he was breeding. AC Reptile has, I think, the best looking empty backs. And they have a very, very large collection. So there are no known health issues that come in with empty backs. They're a healthy morph. They were bred in with a lot of other geckos, and it's a morph that's becoming a little bit more popular because of new information that's come out. And I really like empty backs. I like that empty back. I really like the ones that have a completely empty head and that have lack of dorsal patterning. Something you'll also know with most empty backs, they don't have a lot of side patterning at all. So most empty backs don't have a lot of pattern to begin with. They're a nearly patternless gecko. Some do, but most don't. And I don't know if that's the gene playing a role in that or if it's just people selecting for an animal to have very little pattern to begin with. Also, something interesting to take into consideration, there are there are het and normal phantom empty backs, and a phantom empty back is really difficult to tell apart from an empty back or a het empty back. Now, I have an example of a het empty back charcoal phantom, and I will be showing that to you as well. Like I said, it's an interesting morph. It's fun to work with, and it's just so cool to see something that has a completely empty dorsal. Now, this is a het phantom empty back right here. See this little lady? You can see a little bit of the hint of that pattern, but you can see where that dorsal is kind of emptied. Again, it's more difficult to tell apart than a normal non-phantom het empty back. But she is a het empty back. She's also a quad stripe. Het empty back, quad stripe, phantom. She has a lot of little things going on her. But again, she is a phantom het empty back, and you can kind of see that emptying in the back. She never stands still. Here's a better example of a het empty back right there. You can see that less, it's not as extreme as my original example of a empty back. But again, it's a fun morph. It's becoming more popular, and I think it's going to be great to have these guys in a lot of different collections.